Every morning before the sun had fully risen, a man in torn shoes walked a little girl down the cracked sidewalks of the city. Her backpack was far too big for her, and his coat far too thin for the cold. To anyone passing by, they looked like any father and daughter on their way to school. But what no one knew, not the teachers, not the parents, not even the girl-ass classmates, was where that man went after she disappeared through the school gates. One morning, the principal decided to follow him, and what she discovered would leave the entire school in tears. The man's name was Daniel, and for almost a year he had walked his daughter Lily to school every single morning, rain, frost, or blazing sun. Lily was 7, bright-eyed and full of questions, the kind of child who found wonder in everything. Her laughter seemed to protect her from the reality Daniel tried so hard to hide. They lived in an old van at the edge of town, parked behind a grocery store where Daniel did odd jobs sweeping the parking lot in exchange for food. Every night he'd read Lily stories under a dim flashlight, whispering promises that things would get better, that one day they'd have a real home again. At school, Lily never told anyone about their situation. She arrived on time, neatly dressed in second-hand clothes that Daniel had carefully mended. Teachers admired her politeness, her sharp mind, and the mysterious way her father always seemed to vanish after dropping her off. But as winter deepened, the principal, Mrs. Sanders, began to notice things. Lily's lunches were smaller, her cheeks thinner, her homework occasionally left undone. One morning, when Daniel didn't show up at pickup time, she began to wonder who this quiet man really was, and what he sacrificed each day to make sure Lily never felt less than any other child. The next morning, curiosity, or perhaps intuition, compelled her to follow. The morning was bitterly cold, frost painting the edges of car windows and breath turning to fog in the air. Daniel held Lily's hand tightly, his worn gloves barely keeping out the chill. He kissed her forehead at the school gate, told her to do her best, and turned to leave. Mrs. Sanders followed from a distance, her car crawling slowly behind him. Daniel didn't take the main road. He cut through alleys, past shuttered stores, and finally down to the edge of the industrial district. He stopped behind the grocery store, where his van sat alone. There, he pulled out a small bucket of water from behind it and began to wash the van windows, not for vanity, but to let the light in. Then he opened the back door, and Mrs. Sanders' breath caught. Inside was a makeshift home, 2 sleeping bags, a pile of books, and a small heater powered by an old battery. Daniel knelt beside a notebook and began to write. A list of job applications, maybe, or notes for the day. He moved quietly, methodically, as if this fragile world was held together only by routine and love. Mrs. Sanders realized she was witnessing something sacred, a father's quiet devotion hidden in plain sight. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She began asking subtle questions in the teacher's lounge, trying to piece together Daniel's story. She learned he'd lost his job after the factory where he worked had closed, and with it, his apartment. His wife had passed away years before, and he'd refused to give Lily up to foster care, believing that love and dignity mattered more than walls. Mrs. Sanders faced a dilemma. If she reported his situation, social services might separate them. But if she did nothing, they'd continue to suffer in silence. Then, one particularly frigid morning, Daniel didn't show up. Lily stood outside the gate, shivering, clutching her backpack, her lips trembling. Mrs. Sanders rushed to her side, and what Lily told her broke her heart. Daniel had fallen sick overnight. The old heater had stopped working, and by morning he could barely breathe. He had told Lily to go to school anyway, to be brave. Mrs. Sanders drove straight to the grocery store lot, her heart pounding. There she found the van, frosted over, Daniel slumped inside. He was alive, but barely conscious. She called for help, tears blurring her vision as paramedics arrived and pulled him from the freezing metal shell that had been his home. At the hospital, Doctors said he was lucky, another hour, and it might have been too late. But when Daniel awoke, his first words weren't for himself. They were for Lily. "She made it to school, didn't she?" he whispered. Mrs. Sanders sat beside him, overwhelmed. Here was a man the world had passed by, a man judged by his clothes, his circumstances, yet he had given his every breath to his daughter's future. News of his story spread through the school like wildfire. Teachers organized collections, parents donated supplies, and children wrote Lily notes of encouragement. It was as if everyone had been shaken awake by the quiet courage they'd overlooked for so long. Weeks later, Daniel was discharged from the hospital. But this time, he didn't return to the van. The community had come together. A parent offered him a maintenance job at her company, another family helped him secure a small apartment, and Mrs. Sanders made sure Lily had everything she needed for school. The day they moved into their new home, Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time, silent. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, but to him, it was a castle. He turned to Lily, who was unpacking her books, and smiled through tears. "We made it," he whispered. At the next school assembly, Mrs. Sanders told the story. Not to shame, but to remind everyone of what compassion can do when it meets courage. The crowd was silent, some wiping tears. That morning, when Daniel walked Lily to school again, this time from their new home, he still wore the same worn shoes. But his stride was different. It carried pride, hope, and a quiet victory over everything that had tried to break him. And as he kissed Lily goodbye, Mrs. Sanders watched from the steps, knowing she had witnessed something rare, a story of love stronger than circumstance. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms or capes. They wear old coats, push through cold mornings, and keep walking, because love gives them no other choice. Would you have followed him too?